Okay, we are live.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to WordShedNYC reading series once again on Zoom. I'm very excited to have you all join us. Some of you have not been able to make it out to our in-person events, but I hope that at some point we will all see each other live. And I know Sean and I are planning to have an event at some point in the beginning of 2022 in the spring, where he will join us coming here from Virginia and maybe having some kind of band join our poetry reading. So that would be really awesome. So stay tuned. Just a little bit about WordShed. It's an all-inclusive interdisciplinary community, culturally and creatively integrated, combining art forms and interlocking ideas. We welcome all artists and collaborations, and we aim to embrace artists' vulnerability, creativity, and individuality with hopes that each one of us together feels nurtured and challenged within our internal foundation. I want to introduce Sean Murphy, who I met so randomly as so many of you. And this is the best way to meet people, because also somebody introduced us who is also a really wonderful person that I hope one day will also be featured here. But aside from that, I'm just really happy to give the platform for Sean and his new book, The Black and Blues, which it just came out, and it is really a very, very fun and deep and sad and hopeful and nurturing, and at the same time kind of really brutally honest as well. Look at just different characters and subjects throughout history that obviously have been inspiring to Sean, and I can't wait to hear more about some of the things that I have so many questions. So here is the book. I just wanted everyone to see. So if you could go onto Sean's website or his any kind of social media outlet, and I'm sure you will be able to find a way to reach and get his poetry. Sean Murphy has appeared on NPR's All Things Considered and been quoted in USA Today, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and Ad Age. A longtime columnist for Pop Matters, his work has also appeared in Salon, The Village Voice, Washington City Paper, The Good Men Project, Memoir Magazine, and others. His chapbook, The Black and Blues, was published by Finishing Line Press in July 2021. He has now been 3 times nominated for the Pushcart Prize. One of those times is literally just recently, and I believe one of the poems is from here. And has served as a writer in residence at the Nopi Center at Martha's Vineyard. He's founding director of 1455 Lit Arts magazine, which it's not a magazine, it's just 1455, but there's also a magazine, and this is a really incredible platform as well, which I encourage all of you to check out. Again, 1455litarts.org, www.1455litarts.org. I sound like a commercial. Woo! Okay, to learn more. He has also published short fiction, poetry, criticism, and I also believe a novel. Am I correct? Okay.
You are.
Okay. And 2 nonfiction collections, correct? Okay.
Yes.
So there is so much to say about Sean, which I'm going to actually just briefly read a few of the section in the back of his book, a few quotes from people who have had something to say about the book. Which one particular I really enjoyed. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Ethelbert Miller. Ethelbert, okay. Who is a writer and literary activist, host of On the Margin. wrote, the blues has often been the shadow of genius and can be considered survival music. There's a hardness wrapped in tenderness in the black and blues. Murphy explores salvation and sorrow. He sees and understands beautiful blackness, the mood and sensibility that's not restricted by race. Murphy writes about a condition, something linked to art and creativity, the black and white keys of life. Matthew Shipp, American pianist, composer, and band leader, wrote, the black and blues is a kaleidoscope, deep and opulent journey into the psychic impulses that created the language of a cross-section of many great artists in the modern world. It intersects with the construct, which is society, and the contradictions that are generated from there. I feel in the portraits of the jazz musicians, the rhythm and vibration of their brains forging their cosmos, and the transcendence contained generating its own counter strikes, which could lead to silence and or destruction. Many things are explored in these pages and many questions asked. This was a crucial reading for me, as it was for me. So I also have questions, and I just want to now pass the Zoom on to you so that some other people here could also enjoy your work. Thank you, Sean, for being here.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's going to be hard to live up to all those nice words. And I appreciate you reading those blurbs, especially Ethelbert is a personal hero. He's a brilliant poet in his own right. So I always recommend anyone checking out his work. I done a couple of interviews with him for 1455. And then Matt Shipp, New York City jazz pianist, is one of my favorite contemporary musicians, and his work has been deeply influential to me. So to get blurbs from both of them was really gratifying. So Leah, shall I read a little and then we'll talk, or okay?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I'm delighted. You know, I'll try to leave room for conversation, so I won't read too many poems, but I'll start with a poem that actually isn't in the book, but I think is appropriate for two reasons. One, because this chapbook is part of a larger project. So there's like 40 other poems that are in this vein. And the purpose of the Black and Blues and this project is really my way of looking at and trying to interrogate art and artists, but there's a particular emphasis on jazz and blues musicians, and there's definitely I hope honest and relevant look at how badly America has treated its creative geniuses, particularly its African American geniuses. So a lot of the people featured in this book are from the 50s and 60s jazz scene. But the poem that I think kind of introduces the whole project, and you'll see, and I'm letting people in as I do this, people in the waiting room. This kind of sets the tone, and I think hopefully articulates what I'm trying to do here. It's called "I Want to Stay Here with You Forever," which is taken from Porgy and Bess by Gershwin, which itself was taken from a novel, Porgy, that I first read in college, and set me on a certain path. So in this poem, I have a little bit of fun invoking Gershwin and his work, the classic tune "Summertime," which has been covered brilliantly by everyone from Miles Davis to Billie Holiday to Ella Fitzgerald, et cetera. Nina Simone gets name checked, and the great jazz musician Sun Ra also. So this is I Want to Stay Here with You Forever. Even in the 1980s, it wasn't all bad, because in English 101, I first read Porgy and Bess, and it prepared me for some things, especially when a few years later, Miles smiled, and I finally began to comprehend a thing or two that anthologies and college professors can never articulate. Words failing to explain shit like context and cause and effect. And how could summertime break my mind, then build it back up each time, reaching me in its wordless way? Then along came Nina and Ella and Billy. So by the time I got to post-grad, I knew more about Gershwin and appropriation and how once again, Black artists were obliged to reclaim their culture, elevating us to places we wouldn't need to go if the American dream offered what was advertised. Words, again, talking a big game, but coming up empty in extra innings. And why I see Emmett Till and Rodney King when Sun Ra takes his solo, proving truth's always more painful than fiction because it feels real, even to not so innocent bystanders. And maybe that's why a recording from 1960 can kill me in all the right ways, suggesting something about humankind's deficiencies and redemption, and how wood, brass, and wind express what words never could. So you see, this is what it means when I admit I don't know the blues, but I understand them. Or possibly I've got that backwards because my ears discern what my mind can't define. And that song, that poem specifically references the version "I Loves You, Porgy" by Sun Ra, which I recommend anyone checking out if you want to hear that and understand why I consider Sun Ra a true American genius. The poem that Leah was kind enough to mention that has been nominated for a Pushcart, which is, is just a tremendous honor. It's nice just to be invited, whether you go to the dance or not. Just getting the invitation is nice. The magazine is Decolonial Passage, which who could not want to be published in a magazine with that name? And it's a wonderful journal that I recommend everyone checking out. But this poem that appeared there and has been nominated is in the book. It's called Billie Holiday's Deathbed. And the poem itself is preceded by a little description, which is a true story. And it's funny because I've read this, I wrote the poem and I've read it quite a few times, and it just it ceaselessly is able to infuriate me because of the conditions under which she died. But it also, there's something redeeming about what she left behind in her legacy. But the poem starts with a description. On May 31st, 1959, as she lay dying at the Metropolitan Hospital in New York City, aged 44, Billie Holiday was arrested, handcuffed, and put under police guard for possession of narcotics. So the image of these white men, just the indignity and the horror of feeling that was an appropriate thing to do was what inspired me to write this particular poem, which of course is a celebration of her genius, but is also, really an accusation to, the legacy that we have on our collective hands. Billie Holiday's Deathbed. This busy bee at the end of a life like clockwork, a symphony of service to everything but herself, wings snatched in a world blinded by the way it is, slowly expiring in the sweet nectar of silence, stung with bittersweet poison, an alchemy of blinded faith. And even this they could not abide, their white hot burden unappeasable, like anti-gravity drawing light inside its sense of self, righteous, obdurate, enfeebled from all their inherited fears. Who are these men who know nothing about the blues, inspiring jinxed history with officious ink, corrections bled red outside the margins, ignored or overcome, their shared voice warning, be more like me, or worse still, stay separate, apart, unheard, entitled or at least allowed to live, strange fruit that rots inside dark spaces or gets torn down from trees, weeping their weary hymns of silence, caustic smoke signals blown from burning crosses. What do they know about beauty, their hatred, the only honest thing about them? What did they know about the helpless ones? Helpless for song, helpless for love, helpless for a fix, helpless for joy, helpless for hope. God bless the child that backward men would scorn, ignore, or erase if they could. So I mentioned Sun Ra in the first poem, and of course, there's a poem about him in here. Sun Ra is an incredibly interesting, was an incredibly interesting, well, still is an incredibly interesting human being, a brilliant musician, a very eccentric iconoclast. And this poem is also preceded by a little factoid that I think helps explain some things. Sun Ra, born Herman Poole Blunt, was an American jazz composer and band leader. He adopted the name Sun Ra, claiming he was an alien from Saturn on a mission to preach peace. And throughout his life, he consistently denied any ties to his prior identity. So this poem is entitled Sun Ra's Spaceship. I'm not of this world, Ra insisted, and it was obvious to everyone. He ain't one of us. You see, he swore, I am from out there. I conjure up other worlds that could break your brain. And to be blunt, this claim was only scarcely less credible than faithful suckers talking to an old man in outer space. Listen, magic's a trick when these cities are always the same. Suits suffocating fools and men calling you son, not sonny. An alien in their eyes with black holes for hearts and their ears stuffed with corn. That slop discreet folks covet for colorless meals. When earthlings turn on machines to distract them from inner space. Thank you. I think there's definitely some righteous indignation in these poems. There's definitely some, hopefully a through line of celebration, a real love of these people and the work that they did and what the gifts that they left humanity, and their heroic journeys. Many of the people, then, now, forever, that choose the artistic field are setting themselves up for challenging lives, but it's harder for some than others. And when I think about what really inspires me is bearing witness to people that had every odd stacked against them and still managed to not only persevere, but leave us gifts that we're, hardly worthy of. So there's also, like I said earlier, an attempt to really kind of take a closer look at what is art and what is the artist's life and what drives creativity and how is that complicated when there's things like capitalism and prejudice and myriad other factors that are against all of us. I think it's safe to say at this point, Richard Pryor is generally considered, what the kids call GOAT, the greatest of all time. I think even when he was alive, he'd already carved out that space for himself. But I think what a lot of people that are coming to him now, in younger generations, might not understand or appreciate is the struggles he had, even as a wealthy, beloved comedian and thinker. He suffered mightily and battled demons and addictions throughout his life. And I'm assuming most of us that are of a certain age will remember, but for me, there was an incident. He got into freebasing in the late 70s and early 80s. And there was a terrible incident where he lit himself on fire. And at the time it was reported that it was an accident, the drunken, drugged out accident. It turns out it was actually a suicide attempt. And the image of a naked Richard Pryor running down the street on fire seems to me the most ready-made metaphor for everything this book discusses, and really everything about genius mixed with tragedy and pain and horror and redemption. So this poem, I'm going to read an excerpt. It's called Richard Pryor's Flesh. Every man who tells the truth has to take the heat, face it, eat it, bathe in it, and pour lighter fluid on the flames. This is just what a genius does. You see, the gods demand abnegation, their alms. Mere mortals can put cash in the basket, but certain sorts of men pay a different way. The kind of currency that leaves singed skin and scars. That's the price of admission. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. How? Because bodies are only boats surrounded by the spirits. Why? If you have to ask, you'll never know. Prove you mean it. That means you're real. This life only hurts because you're alive. There's another semi-obscure jazz musician who's really important to me. He was born Roland Kirk. At some point in his life changed his name to Rasan Roland Kirk. He was a blind saxophone player who became somewhat of a novelty. He was wrongly accused of being a novelty act because he was an absolute master and took his music extremely seriously. But he was able to play 3 different instruments at the same time. And he says that doing that came to him in a dream, that he had a dream about doing this and worked and basically built his own instrument. So he played the flute, he played the sax, he was a composer, but he also played this hybrid instrument that's kind of this single image of him and his genius. So, being blind, being Black, being a musician, also did not live an easy life, but his music radiates such unbelievable joy and peace and purpose. He's absolutely one of my all-time heroes. So I wanted to write about him, and this is called Roland Kirk's Dream. It appeared to him, he said, while he slept. Or rather, it revealed itself to him the way visions will, seeming nonsensical to those who claim to see, the light in their eyes conveying what they believe is required of them. No revisions necessary for this rough draft were born into, a book with backward pages or pictures upside down. What if you could train your brain to talk through instruments, creating dialogues out of time or space, sound that surrounds? Are creatures in the darkness of the deep or farthest out in stellar regions sightless? Or do they perceive what nothing else can process, forsaking the cues and clues given to brothers and sisters slower on the uptake? Are they blind or do they see differently? Do our eyes watch or just reinterpret all they're told? Wires pulled behind the scene. Kirk's work shifts things, realigning reality. This is what music says. I was here. I am alive. We don't die when we're no longer here. We are dark stars bringing light for those who can prepare themselves to deal with miracles, where art becomes like armor, protecting and serving. And if too often it falls on deaf ears, it stays made, gets heard, remains unreal in the ways that matter most. Bright moments or an inflated tear exploding like a dream deferred. As it happens, tomorrow is Beethoven's 251st birthday. And I'm a big fan of, the vibrations of the universe and things happening for, inscrutable reasons. It turns out that I wrote this poem about Beethoven a year ago today, because it was the 16th last year, when I was thinking about Beethoven, and I had been trying to write something, someone that encompasses so much and contains so much. I thought it would be an extra challenge to try to write a really short poem about Beethoven. And I think everyone knows, but it's always worth repeating, especially for those that don't know. He lost his hearing, which to me, I talked about the Richard Pryor metaphor, which I'll stand by, but one of the, if not the preeminent composer in the history of humankind, losing his hearing seemed to me as the most cruel, unspeakable, unfair injustice that's ever been done to a human being. And he continued to create because he had to. And I find in that, if I'm ever in a position where I feel bad for myself, I think about something like that, and my problems are shrunk down to size accordingly. So this is a real genuine tribute to a real hero of humanity. And it's called Beethoven's Silent Consecration. Darkness. Too much like death? No, too much like life. This not quite nothingness. An adagio separating suffering and self. Recalcitrant, composing, conceiving entire orchestras, craving illimitable expression. Sound, some sacred requital. The snow falling softly outside, effulgent. Every flake a separate note, each expressing its own song. Silence, dreaming of death, a prolonged peace. Seeing people seeing and hearing, knowing this music will speak when even speech finally fails him. And I will conclude, that's a good note to end on, I think. And it's also always better to err on the side of brevity, but we lost a real literary and cultural icon yesterday, Bell Hooks. And she was a seminal influence on me when I, a straight white male entering grad school in the early 90s, and reading someone like Bell Hooks and her criticism and her way of trying to articulate so much of why we suffer and struggle. And I have to say, I don't think the poetry I write would be quite the same if it wasn't for her. So I want to dedicate this last poem to Bell Hooks. It's called "The Sea is a Woman." She is, in fact, a mother. All life begins with her, and she absorbs it all. The blood of sons and bitches butchering each other, spilled oil and spoils of the carnage that occurs each day. Above and beneath her, all manner of pollution and decay. The death that sustains life, a cycle she orchestrates, watching as even the light fights with inevitable darkness over and over for eternity. But most often, the nothingness that occurs whenever the moon isn't busy moving the tides. On occasion, and understandably, she rages and howls, lashing out, destruction and remorse in her wake. Of course, these moments pass, and in the mild hours of quiet evenings, she is so peaceful, it defies description or even belief. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
Sean, thank you so much. That was so interesting. This is why I love doing this, because hearing the poet, the writer read their work is so different. And it's funny because I'm going to actually touch upon that in some of my questions to you. I just first want to thank you for writing The Black and Blues, because it actually gave me the opportunity to look up some names that I wasn't familiar with. And I went, you know, how you go into Google and you just kind of go into a rabbit hole. But it was really fascinating because it also took me obviously into another space. And, you know, your poems made me want to kind of really understand. And I began to really just feel, aside from the fact of each poem standing on its own as a subject, you know, I wanted to know why those subjects. So in a way, your poetry became like an interactive process for me. And I think that you've just nailed, you know, the whole reason of why we write poetry, because that's basically what we want. We want people to ask questions. We want people to go and find out what things mean, why they're there, and, you know, why someone decided to write about this, right? And so I just want to thank you.
Yeah.
I felt like in some poems, like you were writing an actual, like you were writing to the actual characters. So, and there were something so intimate there. Like I was getting a peek into your dynamic relationship with these artists. And I wanted to know more about what it is that you either admire or are conscious of and want to learn. Like I want to know a deeper intention of what made you pick some of the characters that you write about.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate that. I've explained, you know, talking about this book and this project. I've written quite a bit of music criticism, as well as political commentary, book reviews, movie reviews. I've written a lot of nonfiction, and it has always given me joy. I did a lot more of it in years past, but I continue to do it. I will do it. I love it. But coincidentally or not, I think it's more than a little coincidental, but around 2016, I just started to find that I was as politically engaged and outraged and aware as ever, but I was finding writing about politics increasingly less satisfying, for so many reasons. There's a shelf life. Other people can always do it better, that's dumb, because that should never dissuade anyone from writing. But I mean that there are people who are really plugged in, and that's their sweet spot. So I now find relief when I come across writers who articulate things that I would want to say but don't have the time. But when I turned to what I started to really explore was this notion that with poetry, a lot of these topics I write about and a lot of the poems I read tonight, I personally can't imagine trying to write a short story or an essay or a novel. And in a review, there are, I mean, a good writer, I think, in an essay can go in any number of directions, but there are certain lanes, there's certain parameters I think a respectable critic has to stay in, is objectively, you know, a linear, sensible, you know, can't really use a lot of metaphor. So I suddenly found that with poetry, I could kind of combine some of these obsessions I have and this desire to really celebrate, interrogate, critique, at times attack, accusing bringing myself into it, making myself accountable for my own, you know, weaknesses and short-sightedness. But it seemed like once I hit on this, you know, formula, and the poems all follow a certain pattern. You know, it's a person's name and a certain characteristic or event, or, you know, Billie Holiday's deathbed, Richard Pryor's flesh. For me, that was a way to get into what is, like, if I'm going to pick one thing, you know, Beethoven's deafness, what is like the central metaphor that helps explain everything about them. But then once you get into it, everything can be thrown at it. So, you know, the first poem I read, that riffs on "I Loves You, Porgy," you know, which is a beautiful song anyway, but writing about how I've heard that song throughout my life enabled me to talk about politics, enabled me to talk about history, enabled me to send a shout out to a number of artists, but really briefly. And I find it very powerful to be able to cram a lot of information without it becoming straight biography or without it becoming a review or even an essay, which again, I think is important. But there's something about rendering a subject in poems that to me, I feel like that has a longer shelf life, that those poems will be able to engage with audiences 50 years from now, where, I guess a good essay can too, but when you're talking about art and doing it with a mind of political and cultural awareness, for me, I found it very liberating. So the simple answer to your question, Lee, is to a certain extent, music's such a big part of my life that there's an element of wanting to eulogize and celebrate certain figures that are important to me. So that certainly is why some of them are in there. But to be honest, some of it is kind of happenstance. There are certain poems. One I didn't read is about a fictional character in Full Metal Jacket. The character, Private Pyle, brilliantly and indelibly portrayed by Vincent D'Onofrio. There's a classic scene where he gets savaged by his fellow cadets. But I had the opportunity to attend an event where Matthew Modine spoke about the making of that movie. And so hearing him talk about it, I wanted to talk about that scene. And so that poem came out of kind of nowhere, but it's something that was already kind of deeply in my mind. Another poem, ironically, I think, is about another Vietnam fictional character from Apocalypse Now, the character Chef. And I don't know how that happened, but just one day I was thinking, what if, Chef, who dies in the movie, had lived, and that became for me a metaphor of how Vietnam veterans who survived the war still had a lot of work to do. So for me, again, that was something that I've written about Vietnam. I've written about how horribly we treat our veterans, and many brilliant writers have tackled these issues. But for me, that was way in a poem to work out my own kind of anger at our system, and also, name check a great movie and a great scene, and you just engage. So it's a way to, Dostoevsky, I think, talked about being dialogic, like conversations within conversations in a particular text. That's been something I've always enjoyed playing with. So I think that's what I'm trying to do with a lot of these poems.
Yeah, and I mentioned to you while I was reading your work that the strength of the language and the audacity with which you confront the subject matters, and the reader actually also. And I felt like there was like a sense of realization, like in the vigor of the imagery that you display in your subject's presence, that obeys your language as well, which I felt like had this rhythmic sense to it, each one's differently. And it was just really, again, like me going through not just all these different characters and historical figures, like some of the ones you mentioned, but I also just want to mention some that you haven't mentioned, like Bud Powell, Liz Taylor, Captain Ahab from Melville, who's also a fictional character, Bill Cosby, Trayvon Martin, Henry Chinaski, I think I'm pronouncing him correctly, who is the alter ego of Charles Bukowski, and even Himmler that you talk about, which for me also was like, oh, this is interesting. So I just wanted to know if you could talk about, like, and I know you did touch on the subject of how you came up with some of the characters, but again, like some of these, they were just so, they came from a different place, like and again, because these characters, like what you said, there's kind of a metaphor, but also like what they represent, where they come from, the place where they come from. So yeah, I just wanted to, you've answered pretty much my question, so there's no real question. Yeah, I also wanted to ask about, I read the quote about blues being, survival music. And another question for me, I guess, would be, as a poet and an artist, how do you survive in terms of your creativity when you're facing all the issues that you just brought up about, like, inequality and racism that really just spans through all these generations, that you're touching upon people who lived, who were in the prime of their careers in the 50s and 60s, like you said, but at the same time, all these issues have traveled with us through all these decades. So what can you say about that?
So yeah, I mean, one of the poems I didn't read, one of my other all-time heroes is Charles Mingus, and I've actually written a lot about him, a lot of nonfiction about him and his work. And in terms of his music, just contained multitudes, as did the man. But one of the things I found compelling as exploration that kind of covers all these different angles is in 1957, he released 5 albums in 1 year, and all of them are stylistically different. They're all brilliant. And as a result of that industry, he ended up in Bellevue at a mental institution because of the stress and the strain. And part of this was because he knew he was a genius. And not only was he underpaid and largely unrecognized for a long time, he was considered a second or third class citizen. I mean, we could say that continues today. I certainly would suggest that when we look at, like, the policing and the jail terms given and not given, but to be a legit genius, and have ignorant people condescend to you, I can't even fathom what that must feel like. So I think a lot of the people in this book that I'm talking about, it's the creative struggle that certainly all of us can relate to on certain levels. The rejection, the fear, the solitude, the lack of money and attention, but to actively have your own society whose culture you're contributing to not only not assist you, but actively, hamper you. I find it, to me, that's probably the most heroic thing. So whether it's Billie Holiday, Bud Powell, there's an incident that I talk about in the poem I write about him, where, again, the metaphors are ready-made. He was in between sets at a nightclub, smoking a cigarette out on the street, and a cop beat him upside the head with a nightstick and kind of permanently affected his life for the worse. These things that are just unbelievable that happened, and most of these people still persevered and left their mark. So I guess for me, Leah, in addition to wanting to bear witness and celebrate, and interrogate, there's also a real strong impulse to kind of put a flag in the ground and say, these are people I think more attention should be paid to. And, hopefully if you do it in an interesting and provocative way, it might turn, as you talked about, if people read this book or hear or encounter any of my poems and in turn go check out Sun Ra or Charles Mingus or Bud Powell, that means as much or more to me than any, attention that the poetry itself gets, because there really is a genuine, effort to, in my own very humble way, kind of pay it forward to these people who have improved my life, tremendously. And I know they've improved the lives of so many. So yeah, I mean, so for me, and the other thing about this is, I think when I mentioned the word liberating, in a sense, for this project, although, as you've seen, there's a lot of attention paid to jazz and blues musicians, but also people outside of those genres. So the sky is kind of the limit. I could write about anybody or anything, and to me, it's a neat way to kind of conduct this dialogic history of American culture, where I'm also kind of looking at art and the creation of it and my own relation to how I view that.
Also, it would be such a great idea if people wrote reviews in poetry. You just
Yeah,
you might have created a new genre, is unless it's done and I don't even know about it.
I'd love
But
to know about it. I'm not aware of it either, but
it's
I
so
think,
much more. It's so much more interesting.
yeah, and I think there's also, look, I think there's also an impulse, for me. Um, I personally, I'm not a fan of like sitcoms and romantic comedy movies. I also am not a huge fan of like love poems and poems that I feel like I've read before. So, I mean, for me personally, poems that are either autobiographical or, confessional or confrontational, they certainly move me. So I think I'm gravitating more towards something that, might appeal to people no matter what language they speak, or what their personality is like, or what their level of education is. I mean, anyone can and should appreciate Richard Pryor, and it, to me, it's a fine balancing act between wanting to take a very mature and informed look, but not make it overly intellectual. And I think that's where, if I read my own essays, there's always an element of wanting to appear smart and well informed. And that's a service, right? If you're trying to recommend art or write a good review, you do want to be informed and you want to inform people. But there is an element of cleverness to that, where I think with poetry, it's like there's no net, and the work's got to account for itself. And I think that's a neat challenge.
Sean, such a pleasure talking to you. I wish you lived close by.
Well, I mean,
We could be more-
we've got to keep the collaborative spirit alive for sure. And I think having a reading that combines music will be a very, I won't even say capstone, right? It'll be another nice step in this ongoing dialogue that you and I have started. So I really look forward to making that come to fruition.
I definitely want to make that come to fruition. And the place we were at last time, Otto's Shrunken Head, was actually a really great place. They have equipment for music. So once you and I really have to solidify a date and get that going. But thank you for being here and for your time and for your wonderful creative work. Your poems are really beautiful and informative. And as I said, really also kind of transforming. I'm being transformed into a different space. So I thank you very much for being here. If anyone has any questions or comments, you could just, say anything you'd like to Sean before we go to the open mic. A lot of people are missing because there's just too much going on in December. So I think people are really overwhelmed. But okay, so if everyone is ready, we could start the open mic.
Right on.
Laura.
Well, thank you again, and it's just been absolute pleasure to read and talk. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wish everyone peace and health and happiness.
You too, everybody. Happy New Year before anyone leaves.
Did you say Laura before?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just making sure. So I'm going to read a few poems, and I was thinking about what I wanted to read and decided that I would go for some that I don't often choose to read out loud at readings. So I'm going to start with this one that's called "I'm Not Really Sure What I've Done to You, but I'll Take a Pinot Grigio." And this is a poem that really embraces my love for reality TV. Okay. I watch Vanderpump Rules while my friends party without me, on my evergreen couch, laughing at drunken charades. Jax tattoos his ex's name on his arm. Stassi cackles into the Pacific waves. I eat a kale salad, scroll through Instagram, leggings, sweater, bikini for sale. My former friends posting stories, downing glasses of wine together. Outside, the February cold creeps in. I click the next episode, my little room glowing. They cheers on screen. I raise my tequila to cheers alongside, kiss the shoes of people who don't care. Wooden floors, off-white walls, cluttered bookcase, candles burned to the bottom of the jar, lighter lost in the cushions. Where does LA end and New York begin? Today, I got a manicure to distract me from the ache. Lime green gel powder, hot towels. The manicurist held my hand tenderly. Stassi got a wax, Tom got a tan, Sheena got Botox, our visage unrecognizable. Okay, and then I'm going to read next. Where is it? I'm gonna read Toast to My Friend. I'm apple cored by your vacant silence. Eyes moon big, you gaze past gatherings of grass behind the porch. No longer peacefully high on hallucinogens, seeing each ridge and the tiniest yellow petal, nature's incomprehensible repeated patterns, how the dandelion sways and sparks. Our paths intersect by the sea where we make camp, by the car packed and driving down back roads invisible to the world. We have always been at home with each other, can see the same wistful loop of crooked paved road, the dense forest of mountain laurel. Today, an imprint of myself waits on your front steps with a deck of cards, hoping you'll emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Lucia?
Okay, I'm gonna read a couple of very short things from Longevity River. And this is a chapbook that starts, or the germinal idea was that years ago, I went to a town in the south of Ecuador, in the mountains, a valley, called Vilcabamba. And that in Quechua means longevity valley. And there was this idea that the river that goes through the town has some mineral properties that enhances health and well-being amongst the people who goes there, right? So then I remembered my experience swimming in that river. Well, you cannot swim that much there, like standing in that river. And then I'm gonna read a couple of things about that. Body rafting, a white ghost jumping out of an unfinished song, the sound of distance. Brown rocks under my feet, fossilized eggs, brought back to life by the rapturous waters. My logs, aquatic serpents, as I claim horizontal this river. Okay, and this one, water. Water is always a good answer to thirst and other cravings. But what am I drinking? Beneath its clear manners, bustling insect colonies around, 60% of their DNA, same as mine. Run a wildlife disoriented by the new landmark I have become. And okay, these two. skin. Life swarms around, plant or fish grazes my calves. I instinctively recoil, but it's too late for that. My shed skin cells stay here, perhaps feeding an old sensorial creature. What remains with me absorbs and quenches. And the last one, fish. I can't catch fish with my bare hands. This is not a speed date dinner. In any case, that's an oxymoron. So I skim the water with flat round stones. I swallow my words deboned. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. I know that you were a little bit tired. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Jonathan.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Hope everybody can hear me. I can see Sean's photo, but is Sean still there, I hope?
I'm not sure. He had to go at
Okay.
some point. I don't know.
Okay, well, I originally had lined up a whole bunch of poems, but then when Sean came on and started talking about jazz, which is my major love outside of literature in my life, I shifted gears and I was going to read 4 poems, but I'm only going to read 3 poems. So the first poem, actually, there's only one person on the screen who's ever heard me read this poem once before, and that's Toby, when I was in a workshop with Toby. So this is a poem about jazz. It's autobiographical, and everybody who's listed in it, I have personally seen in my lifetime. So without further ado, I was hoping Sean would be on for this, but hopefully, maybe I'll email it to him.
He will read it. He will hear it.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. This is called I'm Not Alone Anymore in New York City. And it's like I said, it's an autobiographical poem. I'm not alone anymore in New York City as when I first arrived. Not dreaming of bygone times in San Francisco Bayside acid jam guitar sessions or Baltimore street side rhythm and blues serenades from my young haunts. For in this city of cities, I've followed night sounds that ring true to my inner ear. Yours here may be different. I follow what calls out to me. That music of the poet voice spoken, those jazz instruments on the bandstands. I've heard Miles Davis on New Year's Eve at the Beacon Theater blow 3 notes from his trumpet, tattooing my heart. Heard Allen Ginsberg chant his Shroud Buddha poetics in gruff voice with pure mind in an enlightened Lower East Side dive. Heard Lester Bowie doctor his healing trumpet notes and Gil Scott-Heron warm piano chords while winter in America blizzards on as both gently touch springing bass riffs at the bottom line. Heard Charles Lloyd wail on fluted saxophone in the Society of Ethical Culture next to Central Park Green, always anew in the city's consciousness. Heard Sun Ra and the orchestra land from distant planets in after-hour Chelsea warehouses, loft gigs rhapsodizing alien treble clefs singing "Space is the place, space is the place." Heard Herbie Hancock headhunt his way to syncopated sounds, fingers dancing across electric piano keys while he brings it all back home. Heard Charlie Hayden and the Liberation Orchestra free the village vanguard from its basement to the streets. Not as alone as I once was in New York City, for I paid the covers to hear the originals, drank the minimums to soak in those maximums, and high on those improvised standards, stopped at the jazz club's coat room to say, "Pass me my coat, but keep my ego in check," as I sauntered out into still dark early morning city streets to cakewalk home, digging the starless city night as I gaze around, feeling less alone, hearing the familiar melody of the hiss steam of the manhole covers mix in tempo with the rumbled bass line of the rollicking subway. And standing there, took in the stage presence of a flower growing in a sidewalk crack, uplifted, solitary, spotlighted by the full moon of the streetlight as it began to perform. So that's my first poem. The second poem, I haven't been lazy during COVID, so I actually went to a workshop recently, which was a participatory workshop with a poet named Tarfia Faisula. And if you don't know her, she's a Bengali poet who writes amazing poetry. I'll list her books for you in the chat. But she had us do a really interesting thing in the workshop. I don't know if you can see this or not. This is a hand, my hand. I'll try to get this up. There we go. And she had us draw our hands, an outline of our hands, and write a poem inside the outline. And what was interesting about this is in my tradition that I'm part of, in medieval times, Jewish authors and poets and rabbis would write Hebrew words in the images of birds and animals and other things, a process called mycography, which is this is kind of a nod to mycography. So I'm going to read this poem. She gave us a couple of prompts. We had to list 3 colors, 3 plants, a reference to money, a reference to love, and a reference to food. So when you hear the poem, I hope you'll hear all those references. Okay, so this is called Sandwiched. Sandwiched in the blue ink outline of a hand, you had us choose both earths and colors, circling through the palm's lifelines to the perimeter of fingertips, as pale green aloe, yellowing fern, stalwart cacti bloom, nurtured in cracked pottery containers to thrive like a young love cast in life's marathon of lost $20 bills spent on countless dusting books, thwarting my fear of fascism's encroach, my hope and end to all this inequality. I am left with everything and nothing, hungry and want to share and devour the same sandwich as you on this rainy day. That's poem number 2. And finally, my third poem and my last poem, I'm going to end this on a somewhat, I hope, humorous note. This is a poem about, we live in existential times. This is a poem about an existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre. And this is called Sartre Goes for a Stroll. Sartre goes for a stroll. Why, oh why does it have to be this way? You know deeply, counter to your outward assumptions, relative to your hypothesized ideas, in opposition to your surface definitions, that all this, all of what you think you take in, is no more than a bastardized illusion. What is God spelled backwards? What is dog spelled backwards? Someone once joked, supposedly these are man's best friends. One leads the other, one walks the other, both sent out the trail we know we could follow if we choose. Amidst all these changes, why am I left with you? Amidst all these changes, why am I left with me? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jonathan. Always, thank you. I don't have any other poets. We're having a very intimate evening this evening. Toby is going to be our last poet.
I brought one just in case. I don't know, just one.
Please
And
be the last
Jonathan-
poem of
Jonathan-
2021 for WordShed.
Jonathan may have heard this one. The zebra, I don't know. I just felt like reading this. It's kind of quirky. At a zebra's birthday party. And forgive me if anybody has heard this. I don't remember if I read it before. The zoo is crowded with invited guests and gatecrashers too. The crashers complain, not enough booze. I don't go where I'm not invited, I say. A crasher, face painted with zebra stripes, says, aren't you hot stuff? I raise my wine glass to her and apologize. I admit to once crashing a Lower East Side Guess Who Wrote This Poem gathering at Clara's Pub on Avenue C and 4th. No one guessed. It turns out that Clara wrote it, I say. It was the worst of the worst poems. Striped Face agrees. She was there. I don't recognize you, she says. A zoo officiate gathers us in front of the zebra's cage. The zebra, a rare all-white, non-striped something or other, is 4 years old. We all sing happy birthday. I ask myself, why am I here? The zebra doesn't know me. That's my quirky for the night. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Thank you, everyone, for coming out on Zoom, not that far out, but at least sitting longer hours on a screen. I appreciate it. I'm glad that we were able to hear Sean's work, and he's I really look forward to reading his other work. But I'm very excited to start a new year for Wordshed. I hope that in January I'm going to have Marcus Amaker, who is poet laureate of South Carolina currently, and is a very, very interesting poet who is also very, very musically connects his poetry and music and all sorts of creative collaborative work. So I'm just looking forward to having him be on Zoom because he does not live near us. So that would be January. I wish everyone a wonderful rest of December and a happy new year, happy holidays to everyone. I hope everyone gets rest and recharge for the next year.
Happy New Year.
Yes,
you,
Happy New
everyone.
Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Happy
New
New Year.
Everyone, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Leah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.